Alright everyone, this tutorial I have on BlankMapV4 today has to do with collision on objects. So this one is super simple, a little bit to explain here though. So you want to go in the world editor, make sure you got your inspector browser up, again go to the window and find whatever you need in here. This is where you get all these from. So let's say you use my non-crush cars. So these in Blender have a collision property to them in Blender. So when you use them, you want to make sure it's selected to collision mesh because you want it to use the collision mesh I made for collision. So when you run it over, it's not using the actual prop. So if you set to visible mesh final, it's using the mesh that you see, which is going to be grabby and it's not going to be good. So something like this, you want to use collision mesh if it even has one. So let's let me explain more about that. So if you use Bobcat's prop here, this doesn't have a collision mesh because you don't really need one for it. Oh, maybe it does because he has it. Oh yeah, no, it doesn't have one. Even though it's set to collision mesh, if I drive my truck, I can't hit it. So it doesn't have a collision mesh. So if you set something to collision mesh that doesn't have a collision in Blender, it's gonna be drive right through it. So if you don't want it to have a collision, you can also select none. But if you do want something to have collision, always click collision first, and if it doesn't work, then set it to visible mesh final. This will just set that mesh to wait, what? This will just set that mesh to have the collision on it from just the verts on the mesh itself. So if I get out of this, okay, yeah, so that, I don't know what happened there, that was weird. But yeah, so the model itself is the collision. So every time you hit it, it will have collision. And you're going to want to do this for pretty much every one of the props. Most of them don't have collision. So if you want to F7 over here, this is going to not have collision. I'm going to go to F11, select this, say you want it to have collision, inspector browser. So it's that collision mesh, doesn't have collision mesh, so it's just going to be drivable. If you set it to none, obviously it's not going to have collision because you want collision type to none. And if you want it to have collision and you set it to visible mesh final, it will be contactable with whatever the mesh is. This goes the same way with making ramps. So if you want to make a track and you have these ramps, you can actually test the ramps before you use them, like before you align with mesh to them. They act as concrete, I'm pretty sure, or asphalt, so it's not the best representation, but you can still get some practice on it to see how the jumps will handle. So if I set this hump over here to visible mesh final, this one's set to collision mesh. These ramps do not have a collision mesh, so that further explains my point of if it doesn't have a collision mesh, it won't work, even though it's set to collision mesh. So that doesn't work. So you can set that to none or collision mesh to not have collision. And this ramp I put to visible mesh final, which will set it to have the mesh itself as collision. So hopefully you understand a little bit about this. That's why the cars are set to collision mesh and actually have collision, and that's why props are usually set to collision mesh and don't have collision. But if you want them to, you can set them to visible mesh final. This also works for in-game stuff, as you can see here, set to collision mesh and it's collidable. But if you set it to none, then it won't have collision. Let's see if I can do that with it here. Let's just make sure it's the only one. This will be the last example. So if I drive all over to this rock, you will not be able to hit it. Okay, well I hit that rock, one next to it. That one has collision. But if you hit the one that I changed, as you can see here, no collision. So hopefully you guys understand. I went very in depth with this. I think there's no way you won't be able to understand this, but if for some reason you don't, let me know, and I will try to answer it in your comments.